This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update with Tyler Cozzens, director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, begins today's show. He talks about cold storage numbers and the Hogs and Pigs Report. K-State's Susan Metzger, Brian McCornack, and Marshall Stewart continue today's show as they reflect on 1 year of the Institute for Digital Agriculture and Advanced Analytics at K-State. They mention how they are excited to continue to serve farmers and ranchers. Ending today's show is Drew Ricketts, K-State wildlife specialist, with a recap from a study that looked into wildlife in yards and parks and how it is connected to tick populations. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with the cattle market update with Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. Tyler, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Tyler, what has the cattle market looked like this past week?
Yeah, so I would say in general, as far as the market looks, kind of looking at the Dodge City, Kansas price report there that came out this last week, in general, prices are holding pretty strong. If we kind of look a little bit closer at the feeder cattle price side of things, feeder steers on those lighter weight steers, the 500 to 600 pounds, those were actually up $8, almost $9 last week, about 3% to just over $290. 6 to 7 weights were actually $267. That was up 2%, just over $5, almost $6. 7 to 8 weights were actually $258.45. That's actually up 4%, almost $10, a little over $10 from last week. So a good jump there on those 7 to 8 weights. 8 to 9 weights were actually $246.29. That's actually just up over 1%, about $3 from last year. And then those 900 to 1,000 pound steers were $236. On the heifer side of things, the 500 to 600 pounds were $256 last week. That's actually even with last week. So not much change there. 6 to 7 weights were actually essentially $251. That's actually generally even with what prices were last week. 6 to 8 weights, those were actually $235. That's a 1% increase, just over $2 from last week. 8 to 9 weights were $227. Again, up about 1% or about $4 from last week. And those 900 to 1,000 pound heifer feeders were $224.50 last week. Now on the fed cattle side of things, looking at the 5 area average price on the live side, steers and heifers were generally up about $2 from last week, about 1%. So steers were actually $184, heifers were $183.80. So again, that about $2 increase from last week. On a dress basis, steers and heifers were about even from last week. Both steers were at $290.41, heifers were at $291. And again, that was about even with what we saw last week. Now, looking at the wholesale side or choice box beef prices, last week the cutout value was essentially at $3. That's actually down slightly, less than 1% from last week. A lot of that just came from pressure kind of across the board as we look at kind of the primal values there. Chuck was actually down about 1% to $268. Round was actually down 1%, almost $4 to $260. Loin was down less than 1% or about just over $2 to $358. Brisket was $235.70. That was actually down about $2. Short plate was actually $197. It was actually down over $6. Flank was down about $4, almost $5 to $158. The only primal value that actually saw an increase last week was actually the rib. That was actually up just over $2 to $481. So in general, a lot of the pressure across the board there on the cutout side kind of led to a lower cutout value this last week.
And also wanting to mention what you're seeing for cold storage.
Yeah, so that was one of the more recent reports that came out here this last week was just what was in cold storage as far as meat supplies go. And I think it's always good to look at this cold storage side of things because it's just kind of overall gauge and barometer for just meat supplies in the supply chain. So kind of looking at this overall from just the total meat cold storage inventory levels across the board for beef, pork, lamb, and chicken, generally tracking slightly lower than what we saw a year ago. So generally lower supplies out there in the supply chain. Generally an indication of some stronger demand there on the meat side of things, but kind of looking at some of the more specific details from the report. Total red meat in August was actually 875 million pounds. That's actually down about 2% from last year. So if we kind of break that out a little bit more, actually total beef in August was 395 million pounds. That was down fractionally less than 1%, actually 0.1% from last year. Now, in that report, they only break out beef into two categories, boneless beef and beef cuts. So boneless beef in August was actually the majority of the beef in cold storage. It was actually 355 million pounds. That was actually down 0.7% from a year ago. On the beef cut side of things, and that was actually up 6% from a year ago to 41 million pounds in August. Now, switching over to the pork side of things, total pork in August was actually 454 million pounds. That was actually down 3% from last year and is actually the lowest since December of 2023. Now, across the categories of pork that are reported, we saw declines in bellies, hams, and picnics, which were actually more than offset increases that we're seeing in loins, spare ribs, butts, and pork variety meats in August for pork cold storage stocks. Now, looking at those a little bit closer, bellies were actually down 30%, hams were down 3%, picnics were down 32% from a year ago. But loins, posted an increase of 1%, spare ribs were up 5%, butts were up 30%, and pork variety meats increased 21% from last year. So overall, generally lower pork supplies there for the month of August. Switching over to the poultry side of things, total poultry in August was actually 1.2 billion pounds. That's actually down 5% from last year. So breaking that out a little bit more, chicken meat in cold storage was actually down 8% to 737 million pounds. Declines on the chicken side of things were seen across the board for the various categories that were reported. Breast meat was actually down 6%, leg quarters were down 10%, wings were down 22%, and other chicken meat in cold storage was actually down 9%. Now, on the whole bird side of things, chicken stocks were actually down 9% to 755 million pounds. Now, on the turkey stock side of things, those were actually up 2% from last year to 456 million pounds. This is kind of a typical seasonal pattern that we'll see on the turkey side of things, kind of that increasing inventory levels leading up to the holiday season there. Whole turkey in cold storage was up 1.1% to 247 million pounds. Turkey breasts were up 17%, while legs were down 16%. And then also eggs in cold storage were actually down 9% to 29 million pounds, possibly a reflection of some of the lingering HPI issues that we're seeing kind of across the nation here. And lastly, I wanted to just mention some dairy stock information. Butter in cold storage increased 11% from last year to 323 million pounds. And total cheese stocks declined 6% to 1.4 billion pounds.
Last week, Lee mentioned that the Hogs and Pigs report would be coming out. And today, Tyler, giving us what some of the highlights are from that report.
Yeah, so the September 1 Hogs and Pigs report came out this last week. Kind of one of those key reports that we get that only comes out once a quarter. So one of those reports as far as we're looking for, just kind of a snapshot for inventory levels on the hog side of things, and kind of one of those things to keep in mind just from a general overall meat supply availability in the U.S. and what that's kind of shaping up to be as far as overall pork supplies moving forward through the rest of 24 and into 25. So we'll kind of discuss some of those points here. So big picture, September 1 Hogs and Pigs report from USDA showed a slight increase in all hogs and pigs inventory levels, which actually increased 0.5% to just about 76.5 million head. This was pretty close to actually what pre-report estimates had for the all hogs and pigs. And so largely in line with what industry was expecting as far as total all hogs and pigs inventory levels in the report. Now, looking a little bit deeper into some of the other highlights from the report, market hogs posted an increase of 0.7% to 70.4 million head. This was actually near the average pre-report estimate, which is expecting an increase of about 0.8%. So looking further into the market hog weight categories, declines were seen in the lighter weight categories, those hogs that are weighing less than 120 pounds, while increases were posted for the heavier weight categories, those hogs that weigh over 120 pounds. The increased inventory levels for those heavier weight market hog categories are an indication that we should be looking for heavier or higher weekly slaughter numbers through roughly the end of the year, while the lower inventory levels for those lighter weight hogs is a signal that we should be expecting to see slaughter numbers start to track closer to where we saw levels a year ago, and then we should start to see that start to occur kind of the beginning of 2025, see those levels start to track pretty similar to where we were a year ago. Now, looking deeper, the breeding herd reported in the report was actually just over 6 million head. That's actually a decline of about 2% from the previous year. Analysts were actually expecting the breeding herd to decline about 3%, so a little bit less of a decline than expected in the breeding herd from the report there. Now, one of the pieces that the report does is give us is kind of this snapshot of just farrowing. So June to August farrowings that just occurred over the last period was actually 3 million head were farrowed. That's actually down 1.7% from last year. but it was actually pretty close to what analysts were expecting. Prior to the report, they were actually expecting a decline of 1.8%, so about in line there. Pigs per litter came in at 11.72 pigs per litter, an increase of about 0.9, almost 1%. And this was actually close to pre-report expectations, which had an increase of 1.1%. So the higher pigs per litter that we saw partially offset the lower fairings in the June to August period, which led to a pig crop during that period of 35 million head. That's actually down about 1% from last year. And this was actually fairly in line with what analysts were expecting. Now, it does give us some indication as far as intentions for the farrowing intentions for the next two periods. And so for the September to November period, farrowing intentions were actually sitting at about 2.95 million head. That's actually down 0.5% from last year, and pretty close to what analysts were expecting for the September to November period. Now, the December to February period, farrowing intentions are expected to be down about 0.6% to about 2.9 million head. This was actually the opposite of direction of what analysts were expecting the farrowing intentions to be for December to November. Analysts were actually expecting an increase of about 0.2% over last year. So kind of bringing this whole September Hogs and Pigs report together, kind of looking into the spring and summer of 2025, the lower farrowing intentions for the next two periods signals a potential decline in supplies, but this could be partially offset by pigs per litter, which has generally been trending higher over the last several periods. This could lead to a slight increase in hog supplies as we get into the second and third quarters of 2025.
Tyler, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our cattle market update.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
That was Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about the celebration of 1 year of the Institute for Digital Agriculture and Advanced Analytics at K-State with Director of Interdisciplinary Programs at K-State, Susan Metzger, who is one of the directors of engagement with the head of K-State's entomology department, Brian McCornack, as well as we're also joined by Executive Vice President for External Engagement, Marshall Stewart. Susan, Brian, Marshall, thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shelby.
September does celebrate 1 year of ID3A. And Brian, can you tell us a little bit about what is ID3A?
So ID3A is short for the Institute for Digital Agriculture and Advanced Analytics. And, with a title like that, you're probably expecting robots, automation, very tech heavy. And yes, those are all part of it. But at the end of the day, I think what makes this institute unique when you start comparing this across our peer institutions is that this is really people-centered. It is truly an interdisciplinary partnership, really focusing on transforming our learning, research, outreach, and engagement around these digital technologies to really enhance agriculture environment that those agricultural manageable units live in, at the same time thinking about the socioeconomic decision-making that affect farmers and ranchers here in Kansas.
And Marshall, why is this something that the university is focused on?
Well, I think first and foremost, the land-grant university that we have at K-State wants to make sure that we are serving the needs of Kansans. And if we know if we do good things in Kansas, we do good things around the world. And when you think about the state of Kansas in particular, you think about farming and ranching and how important the agricultural sector is to the state. So by using digital technologies, we can make that far more effective. And we also will look at not only the effectiveness on the farm and the ranch, but we also look at the effectiveness of our faculty. We have great strength, Brian being one of those, and many others who have tremendous strength in this space. And we want to deliver that to, again, our folks in Kansas. So it's a strength we have. It's a need we have. And I think it also is something that we see as a priority for the institution itself. We have certainly funded it, began this process a little over a year ago to really stand this institute up and to make sure that it's where it needs to be. And we also know that the success of farming and ranching in the future depends on many things, including the weather and other things. But one of those things is reduce input cost. And when you can do that, and digital technologies enable you to do that, then you're doing things that are really good for the profitability on the farm or the ranch. So it all comes back to that, to helping people do better in the economy. And that's a big reason we're involved in it at Kansas State.
As we end September, it is 1 year of ID3A. And why is this something that's really exciting for the Institute?
So we're very excited that we're officially celebrating 1 year of the Institute for Digital Ag and Advanced Analytics. So last September of 2023, at the Celebrate Ag weekend, we had the opportunity to officially announce that we were an institute, and we're excited about that for a number of reasons. So under our Next Gen strategic plan, which is also a year old, we really emphasize the value of interdisciplinary programming and what that does for addressing the state's grand challenges. And the Institute for Digital Ag and Advanced Analytics was the first interdisciplinary institute out of the gate. And so it's really exciting to be the pilot example of what that interdisciplinary collaborative can look like and how it can address one of the state's grand challenges. So we're excited, already 1 year in, and we have a lot to show for the success and how coming together as an interdisciplinary team can really do different things, leverage resources in different ways, maximize our talents in ways we couldn't do before. So it's pretty remarkable when you just think of just 1 year. Already, we've secured $7.5 million in grant funding, and we have more than $50 million of grant funding pending that we look forward to finding great news about soon, bringing those dollars to K-State, and most importantly, transforming those dollars into important decision-making for the people of Kansas. We're more than research. It is research, teaching, and engagement. So with the teaching part, we routinely offer workshops, both to our campus partners and external partners, about the things that would help advance digital ag and advanced analytics. We're working to develop a graduate certificate in advanced analytics. And from the engagement piece, we're really excited not only about the strength that we've pulled together for our campus partners, but we have several industry partners and new producers throughout the state that are engaged in ID3A, and looking forward to building on that in the next year and years to come.
Brian, what are some of those things that you're really proud of to have seen ID3A accomplish?
The biggest thing, especially internally, is that, we're bringing new folks to the conversation. A lot of the directors have been working in some capacity for maybe the last 10 or 12 years on lots of projects, either with direct industry partners or USDA funded or even commodity grants. And I think, what I'm most proud of is that our take on this is that it's not just this group. Like, we get the privilege and have been charged by, President Linton and Dr. Stewart to really advance what we've been doing, but, cultivate the leadership on campus. We've sought out this last year folks that are innovating in that space, realizing that we can help them in a lot of ways, take what they're currently doing and elevate it. And some of that elevation looks like partnerships that they didn't have with industry. And I think, one of the projects we're currently working on is actually a Group X. So that's a game-changing research initiative program that focuses on AI. And Pascal Hitzler is definitely leading that effort in terms of AI here, but also working with AJ Sharda on robotics and working with a local Kansas, company that is really interested in taking planters to the next level, really revolutionizing how we think about putting that seed in the ground and following the seed all the way to harvest and figuring out how does that impact the growers who are going to buy that seed to put it in the ground the next year. And really thinking about that as an entire holistic system is, to me, the most exciting piece. I'm an entomologist and I nerd out about bugs, and I promise I won't do that this morning. However, I also like the automation, the robotics, the being able to work with other people who think differently about that exact same system. Just energizes a room that I wish others could be a part of. We're working with Power Pollen, working with some other folks that once they heard that K-State is putting a significant amount of value in digital ag and advanced analytics, people have been reaching out. And I think that sends a really strong message, not just to our state constituents, but definitely the region, that innovation and leadership can happen here right at Kansas State University. And to me, that's probably the most exciting piece, is that we've got the folks here. But at the same time, we want to partner with others that are interested in seeing this vision come alive.
As we reflected on the past year, what makes you excited as we look forward, Brian?
As we look forward is meeting new people, making sure that people understand how they can get connected. And those are things that we're talking about as a board of directors, is looking to our affiliates and scholars and seeing how they can actually plug in to really strengthen the network of folks that are in this space. And to me, that's, looking ahead, that's where we'll continue to build. And I guess what I'm most excited about.
Marshall, from the university level, what makes you excited for this to be one part of the next gen that keeps moving forward?
It's interesting that last night I was at a beef dinner here on campus, had a lot of producers there, and I sat at dinner last night with a couple ranchers that actually manage ranches in not only Kansas but Oklahoma. And one of the things they told me was, what the older person that was sitting there, about my age probably, he said that probably 15 years ago or so, he was involved in a workshop here on campus. And he learned about how to take, and I'm going to give you a piece of technology here, a Palm Pilot, and I had one, and he said, you probably know what that is. I said, I do. The young guy sitting to my right had no idea what we were talking about. He said, we had a Palm Pilot that we actually loaded programming on, and that it was a piece of technology at the time that helped us manage our beef cattle herds better. And so what it said to me, and this is real time, last night at dinner, this is happening unrehearsed, just happens. It tells me there's been a great history of using advanced technologies across the board at Kansas State University. So you go back to the Palm Pilot. Now we've got the iPhone, and you've got everything that's advancing beyond that. It just tells you where we want to be as an institution. We want to be at the forefront, the cutting edge, if not the bleeding edge, of where technology is and advances, that not only to have the discoveries, but then to bring it inside the tools we have, the iPhone or the Android or whatever it is that people may use today, to enable them to use that technology to make better decisions, to ensure that they're, again, being profitable in the farm or ranch, to ensure that they're being good environmental stewards, which I know all our farmers and ranchers want to be and strive to be. How do we do that in a collective way? And that's what Kansas State wants to be about. And as Brian has articulated, Susan has too, if we do that, we'll not only be a state leader in this space, but more importantly, we'll be a global leader in this space. And that's where we want to be, is providing global leadership and how to bring this to the farm, how to scale it, how to make it applicable to their lives every single day. So it's exciting for us, and it's what the university's trajectory is on as a next generation land-grant university.
Susan, as we round out today's conversation, what are you hoping to have this bring to farmers and ranchers in Kansas?
It really is the exciting part of being a land-grant institution and having ID3A housed here, is the opportunity to directly impact the lives and livelihoods of Kansas farmers and ranchers, all of our learners throughout the state and globally, like Dr. Stewart mentioned. So really what I think of as the key part of what we deliver is on that advanced analytics piece. So how do we take the things that are coming from all of that great technology and emerging things that are coming? In agriculture, we collect literally terabytes of data on a daily basis. And I've often heard it say that we are data rich, but information poor. And so ID3A has the opportunity to help our farmers and ranchers make great use of data for informed decision making that improves their productivity and reduces environmental impacts. So I hope others come and learn more about ID3A, celebrate our 1-year anniversary with us. You can learn more at kstate.edu/ID3A.
That was Director of Interdisciplinary Programs at K-State, Susan Metzger, and she was joined by Head of K-State's Entomology Department, Brian McCornack, and both Susan and Brian are Directors of Engagement for ID3A. Susan and Brian were joined by Executive Vice President for External Engagement, Marshall Stewart. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we round out our Monday show talking about wildlife in parks and yards with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shelby.
Drew, this study recently looking at how much wildlife really goes in parks and yards, and can you set up this research a little bit for us?
This was a study that was done in New York City, so not really close to here, but definitely a place where they have lots of people and also lots of green space. And they basically surveyed the parks or the green spaces to see how many different critters were in those green spaces, how many different species of critters, and they were focusing specifically on mammals. And then they compared that to the number of species of mammals that they found in yards. They also looked at some of the different habitat characteristics that they found, especially in the yards, versus the habitat characteristics that were available in parks. And really the reason that they were interested in doing this study was they were looking at disease transmission by ticks, potentially to people, and the mammals in this were actually sort of the way that the ticks could get in yards or parks and that sort of thing. And they basically assumed that they would find more species of mammals in the parks or the green spaces, and fewer species of mammals in yards, and they thought they would see the same sort of thing with ticks too.
And what mammals did they see coming into those yards and parks?
Yeah, so a lot of the different critters that they were looking at were critters that we would expect to see, like white-tailed deer, raccoons, opossums, squirrels, and in that part of the world, the most common squirrel that they would see would be gray squirrels. Of course, in Kansas, it depends on if you're in far eastern Kansas or further west, whether you're going to see gray squirrels or fox squirrels, groundhogs, opossums, rats, couple of different species of small mammals like mice, voles, shrews, moles. So they looked at a whole bunch of different mammal species that could be present in a yard.
And if they saw more of those mammals, did they see an increase in tick populations?
It was interesting. So they saw more ticks associated with certain species. And so if there were deer present in a yard or a park, then they were going to find more ticks. Of course, that's one of the common things that we would expect. But they also saw a strong association between the raccoons and the ticks. And so that was something that they didn't necessarily expect to see, but they saw that for sure. They also saw that there were actually more species of critters in yards than there were in the parks. And that was basically a reflection, they think, of the additional food resources that might be present in yards and also the habitat complexity that's available in some yards versus the parks. So if we think about a park as being mostly a big area of turf grass with some scattered trees and that sort of thing, that might be less habitat actually than what we would find in a yard that could have resources like bird feeders and trash and plantings of different types of tall or short vegetation, and then also things like brush piles and that sort of thing.
So if people are wanting to attract less wildlife, what should they probably do?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I thought this study did a good job of emphasizing is that, we oftentimes attract critters to our yards by having cover like brush piles, maybe in the presence of bird feeders, trash cans, and those sorts of things. And that can lead to lots of different kinds of conflicts like we've talked about. And so specifically thinking about reducing raccoons in the yard, any sort of woody cover that's creating habitat like brush out in the yard, logs. They specifically said if there were logs out there, you were more likely to have raccoons, and then the ticks that were associated with those raccoons as well.
So, Drew, with these animals, is this also, if you don't mess with them, they won't mess with you, but hopefully find a way to get them taken care of?
Yeah, so typically we don't see raccoons and opossums and deer and those sorts of critters intentionally interacting with people. But when we do attract them to the yard, then, like we said, we attract the things that are on the outside of them, like ticks. We also attract any diseases that are on the inside of them. And then we really attract that potential for them to interact with our pets in negative ways and those sorts of things.
Drew, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Shelby. I always enjoy it.
That was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.